So good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Perrine Hamel. I'm an assistant professor at Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. It's my pleasure today to host this session on nature-based solutions for flood risk mitigation with three of my colleagues who join us today. So Blair Spendelow, who is the technical director for the flood consultancy JBA. Blair is here with his video on. Misaka Hetiarachi, who is a senior fellow at the World Wildlife Fund, and Kimirvin, who is a visiting associate professor at Thammasat University in Thailand. So before we begin, I'd like to set the stage, and before each of the speakers will get a chance to give a statement on the question, I'm setting the stage with a few facts on nature-based solutions in Southeast Asia. I'm hoping that everyone can see my screen at the minute. So I guess I don't need to remind anyone here, if you join this session, that our world is changing, our planet is changing, and that's in terms of land use change as well as climate change. So the effect of climate change, of both these changes on flood risk are extremely important, whether it's in Asia or globally. We know that flood hazard and flood risk are increasing. I don't know if they're gonna reach the moon, but it is a serious concern that many of us are working to address. So some of us feel like there's technological progress that can help address these questions. So we don't really know what form it will take, but that's definitely part of the solution and a big push towards reducing and addressing flood risk in cities. But there's also a lot of work being done on reconnecting us with nature. That can be spiritually, but also in terms of these nature-based solutions, the idea of using nature to infiltrate more water, leave more room for flood water in a way that will reduce flood hazard for cities. So that's the general setting. If we zoom in on Asia, and in particular Southeast Asia, there are a few characteristics that are important to keep in mind. One is that the urban population growth is extremely fast, more than 3% in countries like Cambodia. There's also a reality of informal settlements and slums. It's estimated that up to 56% of the urban population lives in slums, which is a very different reality from what's happening in many cities in the global north. And finally, there is an important need for new water infrastructure. That's water and sanitation, as well as flood risk. And it's estimated that more than $500 billion will be needed for by 2040 in Southeast Asia. So also an opportunity to make nature-based solutions part of this response. So recently reviewed the literature in Southeast Asia, both the scientific literature as well as gray literature. And of course, when we think about flood risk and flood hazard, we think about the hydrologic performance of this natural infrastructure. And we've realized that there was some knowledge in the region, of course, but some of the important questions about practical implementation are still insufficiently addressed in this literature. Questions about climate change, how these solutions, nature-based solutions, will perform in the future, how their combined effect will play out across the scale of a city or a watershed. What are the maintenance requirements? What type of natural infrastructure are more adequate in informal settlements? So a lot of questions that are still important to address and increase our knowledge, scientific knowledge on these questions to make sure that we make the most of these nature-based solutions. But of course, that's not the only thing that matters when it comes to making these solutions hit the ground. And we know that our cities are complex systems, and it's important to think about these nature-based solutions as part of a social, ecological, and technological system. So only by understanding the combination of these interactions now and in the future, we can make sure that these solutions can effectively provide the benefits that they're supposed to provide. So that's all I will say for this introduction, and I'd like to explore these questions with our three panelists today, whom I'm going to let introduce themselves. We're going to do that, ask them to give a 6-minute statement answering this question of what do we think is the most needed to address this question. And then we'll do a Q&A helped by my colleague David Lallemand from Nanyang Technological University as well. So to make sure that you're not already checking your emails, I know this is very tempting with these online conferences. I'd like to invite you to join this poll and answer the question that we are addressing today, which is what is the most needed to mainstream the implementation of these nature-based solutions. So David will also paste the link in the chat box, but you can just go to wooclap.com and with the code NBSAsia, that's going to be on the next slide, and give us your thoughts on what you think is the most needed. Put it in other words. If you had $10 billion tomorrow, where would you invest this money? Would you invest it in more science, more engineering? Would you invest it in capacity building on the ground? Direct funding, and that could be direct investment or wise investment to make this money go even further, or political will, and I guess it can be political leaders or thought leaders in general, making them more aware of what we need to do to make these solutions more mainstream on the ground. So while we are waiting for your responses, I'll invite our first panelist to share his views on the question. So Blair, if you want to go ahead, I'm going to unshare my screen, and we'd love to have your thoughts on the question.
Thanks, Pring. Let me just share my screen. First test of the day.
Mm-hmm.
So is that working?
Yep, that's great.
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks, Pring. Have really enjoyed the process to this point of being involved in the session today. Thanks for asking me to come along and contribute. My name is Blair Bindlo. I am a technical director at JBA Consulting, which is a specialist flood risk consultancy. Most of my experience has been through consultancy with a technical background around coastal management, mid-ocean design, integrated coastal resilience. More recently, I've just completed a second MSc in finance and economic policy. I think climate change, more than almost any other problem that we face, requires the coming together of different disciplines. And so I was quite interested in the economic aspects, because I think, as morally right as it might be to do something about climate change, if the economic incentives aren't there, then it's going to be difficult to move in the right direction. I also think adaptation isn't going to be something that's solved by the politician alone or the engineer alone. It's about coming together and coordinating the different stakeholders, which is going to be the thrust of my the points that I would like to make on the question at hand. So I'll make three main points over the next 3 slides, but just to sort of present an overarching theme of those thoughts. It's really about coordination across disciplines and sections of the academic world, coordination of different levels of government and communities, and along with that coordination, of course, requires communication. And while I'm most of my experience is more from the technical disciplines, it may be funny to hear a technical person saying that we need more of non-technical aspects to come together. And maybe that's my bias as well, because I think we do have a lot of the tools already, and those tools may be improving and new innovations may come along. But from what I've seen in my practical experience, it's a lack of coordination, which has made some of the tools and methods that we have difficult to apply on the ground. So point number one I would like to make is that all these intangible benefits that may come as second or third order relationships between communities and their ecosystems is difficult to quantify. And these benefits are also often don't fit neatly into financial appraisal techniques. That's probably quite an obvious statement for anyone that's looked into the valuation of ecosystems and the services they provide, which is now quite a mainstream part of economics. But I think from a practical perspective, we have seen a real need for and often a lack of coordination and communication between actors in a specific jurisdiction. I think greater coordination could contribute to the knowledge basis that is required for the economic appraisal of ecosystem services. And it's this consistent and comprehensive data basis that is required and is often missing in the places that we've worked. I think it's known that the economically vulnerable people often inhabit the most physically vulnerable locations as well. And this is especially true in low-income countries, but also these groups are often less engaged in the political process, which often comes into play when designing integrated flood risk management solutions. So I think genuine buy-in to the process of public consultation and stakeholder engagement not only provides a valuable platform for risk communication, but also as a way to understand the cultural and ecosystem service values associated with an ecosystem. And we've also seen that this component could be strengthened in the places that we've operated in. And the final point, which kind of brings, I think, those two previous elements together, is the development or the mobilization of tools around communication and optioneering. The tools exist largely, and there's more and more becoming available. They get more complex and are able to include different things. But the way that risk is communicated as part of the stakeholder engagement process, and also how different components of the overall design of an integrated flood risk management solution is drawn out from public opinion it could be strengthened. First, we need to organize. This is a sort of framework that we present when discussing this. We break it down into these iterative loops along three themes: design, decide, and model. First, we need to organize with a decide loop that can draw out the values and prioritize the range of stakeholders, engaging them through communication and understanding what is important to include in a framework. And it's the framework that determines the key structures in which the optimization is measured. And it's not until very late in the process that we might actually get down to modeling in the traditional sense in the world I come from, where modeling means hydrological and coastal process modeling. That really needs to come last after all these different other optioneering loops have been given some time to generate some ideas and opinions. And then it's never really a complete process. You need to re-engage in those different different loops to ensure that the optimal overall design has been met. So those are my 3 points. I think, yeah, the overarching theme is, from what we've seen from practical experience, if we can engage communities, different stakeholders at different levels, and organize right from developing the databases for the decisions that things are made to communicating risk, these things will help develop the best outcomes for communities.
Great. Thank you, Blair, for this perspective from your experience, and to some extent reflecting some of the experience of the private sector and flood consulting firms. I'd like to remind everyone that you are very welcome and encouraged to ask questions using the chat box. We'll let the three panelists give the 6-minute statement and intro, and then we'll take these questions. So without further ado, I'd like to invite my colleague Misaka Echarachi from WWF to share some of his thoughts, and please introduce yourself as well. I've asked each of them to also share something that was not necessarily in their official bios to make it a little bit more personal. Misaka, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Perrine. Let me just share the screen. Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all who are connected. My name is Misaka Echarachi, and I currently work as a senior fellow for the World Wildlife Fund and also the lead trainer of WWF's Flood Green Guide program. Now, before starting this career, I had my basic training in environmental engineering and civil and environmental engineering. I worked as a water sanitation engineer for some time, and probably to avoid just being as remembered as a toilet engineer, I did a PhD in environmental planning. So I still, in addition to my work with the WWF, I still do a little bit of teaching and research in the academic sector. Now, you might wonder what WWF, which is commonly known as a conservation agency, doing in the disaster sector. WWF's involvement in the disaster sector started after the Indian Ocean tsunami in 2004, which is by and large the largest disaster recorded in the modern times. And initially, we were involved more in the post-disaster aspects, such as post-disaster reconstruction and so on. But in 2013, WWF was invited to develop a guideline on natural and nature-based methods in flood risk management by the USAID. So since then, our focus have been equally divided upon the post-disaster aspects as well as pre-disaster, risk reduction. Now, when we started this project, Flood Green Guide project, we faced the same problem, we encountered the same problem that we are discussing today. Even in 2013, there was a sizable amount of knowledge available about natural and nature-based solutions. The technology was available. So the question was, why are NBS's nature-based solutions not being mainstreamed in flood risk management? Now, with that, I'll go to this simple mind map, which is something that we kind of unofficially put together to understand what are the main factors affecting the mainstreaming of nature-based solutions. Now, which of these factors are more prominent might change based on where you come from, your viewpoint, and what your interests are. But we can say for sure that there is an adequate level of technology which is good enough to start mainstreaming NBSs, if not being good enough to be implemented in a full-scale way. And also in terms of national policy, there is a growing acknowledgement that there should be a turn towards nature-based solutions globally. So in our work, we identified 3 factors. One, lack of professional capacity and training. Second, lack of institutional capacity. And third, the standards, the delay or unavailability of NBS-friendly standards, industry norms, and practices. Now, these 3 factors we realized through our trainings, through development of the guideline and also through our trainings, that they work in a vicious cycle, kind of vicious cycle, where a lack of professional capacity leads to lack of institutional capacity. That again leads to the delay in developing industry norms and practices, which of course, when you don't have industry norms and practices in place, you can't develop the capacity along those lines. So it works as a kind of a vicious cycle. And the thing is, you can start with any of those factors and you'll end up with the 3 of them. But in addition to that, when there is a delay in developing industry norms and when there's lack of institutional capacity, this leads to a kind of a policy path dependency, where conventional methods are picked up more easily, are preferred against natural and nature-based solutions in flood risk management, which again causes a reluctance to fund nature-based solutions. And when there's no funding, when there's no projects in place, that leads to a poor evidence base for nature-based solutions, and that creates a secondary loop, which again leads to a lack of, when you don't have enough evidence, when you don't have enough demonstration on the ground, that is a main barrier to develop professional capacity. This perpetuates this vicious cycle. Now, our approach to address this question in a small way, of course, with the Flood Green Guide program with WWF was, we developed this Flood Green Guide, guideline document in 2017. It's not a technical manual. It addresses the questions along the flood risk management decision cycle at different stages, as you can see in the figure in the middle, in different aspects, and it provides some general information in different aspects to help especially the middle-level decision makers incorporate natural nature-based methods into flood risk management, throughout the cycle. So it's available freely. So I will take this opportunity also to welcome you to access it and have a look. So these are the points that I wanted to make, what we think as WWF are the most critical factors that hinders mainstreaming of natural nature-based solutions. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Misaka, for sharing a little bit about this very ambitious program. I hope we'll have time to hear more about it in the discussion. But before we do that, I'd like to invite Kim to provide, Kimirvin, a visiting associate professor at Thammasat University, to provide his thoughts on this question of what are the main barriers to mainstreaming nature-based solutions for flood risk mitigation in Asia. Kim, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks, Parin. My name's Kimirvin. I've been in the Faculty of Architecture and Planning at Thammasat University in Thailand for the past year. Prior to that, for the previous 8 years, I was at Nanyang Technological University in Singapore, mostly in Singapore at least, working on PUB-funded projects looking at modeling water quantity and water quality with respect to urban runoff, and focusing to some extent on looking at water-sensitive urban designs. We were also working in Cambodia, Thailand, Vietnam on some of these issues. So I guess the question is, what are the barriers to implementation of nature-based solutions for flood management in this region? And as we've looked at, do we need more science, more capacity building, more funding, more political will? I guess I would argue that probably really it's a complex interaction of all of these different elements, as we've heard already. But in addition, we have layered on top of that some issues of policy and agency fragmentation and decision-making. Probably we need a local champion in some way. And we also have continued uncertainties, I think, regarding the benefits and the costs of nature-based solutions. And so in addressing this idea of benefits and costs, and that's what I'm going to focus on for the next few minutes, I think we need to do a better job of promoting some type of meaningful multidisciplinary lens. So if I start by looking at water-sensitive urban design, and of course this is very much a pluvial flooding approach. I'm showing here the Centenary Hall at our university campus at Thammasat University. This building is the largest green roof building in Southeast Asia, but it's also, interestingly, a functioning urban farm. It's a wonderful design. It really is a signature piece for the campus. But that said, we're only starting to get a handle on the performance, the benefits, and the costs of this particular design. The way we're doing this right now is to use a modeling approach. And so the picture that you see on the upper left is how the Centenary Hall looks in real life. And the picture on the lower right is how we're representing it in a dynamic mathematical model to start exploring performance issues. We're combining the modeling with sampling, so we get some idea both on water quantity and water quality, how the system is reacting. Ultimately, then, I think this comes to the role of visioning and how we go from the design to evaluating performance, but we also need to consider scale issues. So for example, this is local scale. It's an example of one water sensitive urban design feature, but and that's useful to look at, but in fact, preferably, I think what we'd want to do is take a systems approach and look at how an entire system might operate. So this is an example of a master plan from one of our year 3 landscape architecture classes for a local area. And we see, the interconnection of blue space and green space. There were constructed wetlands, rain gardens, and so on. And it really is a wonderful design. But the question then becomes, how do we evaluate the performance of this design of an integrated system? If we scale up even further, another example from our urban design, one of our urban design classes for a regional area, we've got the Chao Phraya River to the west, to the left there, and this particular student group took the approach of looking at retreat, adapt, and defend. So in the peri-urban agricultural areas, which are mainly rice fields shown in green, they suggested that we could use these areas as detention areas to store flood waters. Of course, it would require negotiations with local farmers and say something like a payment for ecosystem services approach. They also looked at defend approaches, which are in purple, and this was in an industrial estate area around near the campus. And already there are hard engineering solutions like flood walls implemented, but the previous slide that I showed also looks at some of the approaches that are being examined by the designers and landscape architects to use greenscapes, green space and blue space to help adapt and defend to floodwaters, both localized flooding, but also fluvial flooding. Finally, we've got an interesting one, which is the adapt idea. And this is the design to the far right with this example of amphibious buildings. how do we adapt our societies to flood? Ultimately, then, I think connectivity of the green space and the blue space becomes a key theme in these designs. Just to wrap up, I wanted to share with you this particular approach to design. And this is where we start to address the issue of the interdisciplinary lens. So these are example designs from a landscape architect class, a year 3 landscape architect class that we have at Thammasat University. And this is an area, again, near the industrial estate that I was talking about, which has a solid waste disposal site, but existing pond areas. And there are some thoughts to redeveloping this area. So this is the visioning process from the landscape architect students on one example of how this area might look in the future, where you start to integrate recreational opportunities, nature, and so on. But the question is, how do we go from this design? How do we know that this design is performing as it should? What are the benefits with respect to water quality and water quantity? But what also are some of the costs? So I also teach an engineering class at Asian Institute of Technology. And as part of that class, we apply mathematical models to hydrologic and environmental systems. So this year, what we did was I brought both classes together, the landscape architecture class and the engineering class at Asian Institute of Technology, to try to get the two groups of students to work together and see how this would work out to integrate better the design with the modeling process. And so this is what we did. We see here that the landscape architecture students are in the field with the engineering students, explaining their vision within the different designs. So there were several different groups working on different types, different design visions. The bottom picture shows the solid waste landfill in the back. And what we see on the far left is how the engineering students overlaid their mathematical modeling, the drainage system in this case, and also an effluent treatment system, and overlaid it directly on top of the design in this example. So we're starting to see how these groups can come together as student groups to effectively integrate both the engineering and the design. But we have a long way to go still. It wasn't as smooth a process as I had hoped. In some ways, the engineering students did a good job of modeling, but didn't necessarily do such a meaningful integration of the actual design itself. And so these are issues that we need to do better on. I certainly think universities often talk a good game about multidisciplinary interactions, but still are very silo oriented. So in the end, then, I guess what we want to be able to do is take some of these really innovative and awesome ideas that our landscape architect and our architect and urban design students are doing, and see not only how we can improve the livability, the sustainability, the resiliency of urban areas, but with respect to the aesthetics, but also with respect to performance. So I think with that, I will end. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kim. There's a lot of things that you presented, and a running theme through the 3 presentations about coordination and breaking the silos, which is something that we hear over and over again, and that I think this Euro 2020 conference is an example of ways to do that, having these conversations. So I'd like to encourage everyone to ask questions in the chat box if you have any, specifically on the materials and the contents that was shared, as well as reflections on this question. While you do that, I'm also going to share my screen again to share the results of the poll and the question that I've asked at the beginning of the session. So not all of you had a chance to enter the Zoom session. I will ask the same question again at the end of the Q&A, but it's interesting to see that capacity building seems to be the least important thing depending on what people mean by capacity building as well, which is interesting to me, because I feel like for the three presentations, there was some talk about whether at universities or in practice with the professionals from the private sector or from local governments. This is something that we still, all of us, need to educate ourselves and change the way we practice flood risk management. So that's an interesting result of this poll. Perhaps I can start us off with a first question to the panel, and I'll invite all panelists to share their videos right now. I was wondering, given these results from the poll that I've just shared, Misaka, would you like to elaborate a little bit more on your experience with the Flood Green Guide training program? I know you've conducted a number of workshops in the sessions. What do you think is the thing that you hear the most, and especially from engineers who might not have had a training that's like with nature or natural methods? I'd love to hear some of your personal experiences with during the trainings.
Yeah, thanks, Perrin. Yeah, so like when we really walked into this sector, our assumption was that we would meet a lot of resistance from the engineers, as you named, like one particular stakeholder group. But surprisingly, we didn't. I mean, especially like younger the audience of engineers are, like more conducive there to the idea of natural and nature-based methods, and probably it comes from like probably a few decades of challenges regarding conventional engineering methods, and the recent failures we've had and all that, and even in the recent typhoon about a couple of weeks back in the Philippines, we were told, like, we were conducting this online training, and one of the participants from from the Philippines said one issue was like dam spilling, right? So one issue which exacerbated the damage was dam spilling. So maybe because of that, we encountered much less resistance from the engineers. So we've done trainings in number of regions, South America, many in Southeast Asia, and a couple in the developed world as well. So this had been a consistent experience for me. And then just going into the results of the poll, actually, this we get almost in every training or discussion we have, that people seeing the lack of political will is the main barrier, which of course is very real, and I totally agree with that. But I have this pre-prepared answer for that, a saying by an American political commentator, it's Reinhard Niebuhr, if I'm pronouncing it correctly. And he said, nothing would enter politics unless it is otherwise irreconcilable, right? So the politics indeed is a problem, but like, no, we see it as a problem because it enters politics because all other methods have failed, right? So that applies to this barrier of political will in flood risk management as well. So we in our sectors actually, there's very limited ability for us to directly intervene and change what's going in this political sphere. So what we can do is actually working around it and influencing that sphere in different methods. We talk about this a lot in our training programs in terms of developing flood risk management objectives and so on. So I'll just leave it with that thought to work around this problem of will. We can, there are so many other steps that we can take as the speakers discussed today. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm glad you bring that up, because it is almost a way and that people can use to play the blame game and saying that there should be people higher up really trying to mainstream these methods. And I think one common theme that emerged from all the presentation was that we all have a role to play, and it's complicated. So it's complicated to know who has leverage to really push this type of infrastructure in projects, whether it's from the private sector, whether it's our responsibilities as educators in universities as well. So there are these questions of who needs to push first or do we actually need to make sure to coordinate better, which was, I think, one of Blair's points. I can take a couple of questions. One from David Lallemont, my colleague at NTU, who's mentioned the uncertainties about benefits and costs of nature-based solutions. So that's for Prof. Irvin and others. How do you think they compare to uncertainties in grey infrastructure? That's also a commonly heard argument that it's kind of a double standard for green and grey infrastructure. So Kim, would you like to take and share some thoughts on this question?
Sure. Thanks, David and Perrin. Maybe I can say a few words, and probably also Blair would, with his presentation also, I think points well taken. I guess in some respects, I think, yeah, there's less uncertainty with respect to grey infrastructure in quantifying benefits and costs compared to green infrastructure. I mean, one of the issues that that we look at, we encounter quite frequently is maintenance costs in particular. So a municipality, for example, will put in green infrastructure, but then who pays for the maintenance, especially if you're putting in extensive amount of water sensitive urban design, for example. So those become issues. But I think also the benefits also are not necessarily well quantified. There's still uncertainty in that, and even in the approaches, whether it's a monetization approach for evaluation or a different type of resiliency approach. But I think things are improving, but there are so many benefits that we don't necessarily think of immediately that may not end up being monetized to show the benefits of green. So I think there's still definitely a way to go in addressing uncertainties there.
Yeah, thanks. Blair, would you like to complement this answer on uncertainties and double standards between green and grey infrastructure?
Yeah, absolutely can. I think I just agree with Kim's sentiment really, and I think I covered it mostly in my presentation as well. If I could just maybe divert attention back to the survey, because I think Misaka made a really interesting point, and I think it does still relate to this question of uncertainty around green versus grey, especially in developing countries. I think maybe the capacity building element is underestimated. And I think back to Misaka's presentation, these loops that sort of, when one of the pieces of the puzzle isn't quite there, it sort of permeates to another piece of the puzzle. And I think it might be easy to misconstrue capacity building with capacity building being mistaken for a lack of political will. And I think it also goes back to what I was saying about relying on coordination over a range of different stakeholders, not just the government, to get involved and engaged in the process of quantifying ecosystem services and communicating risk to all play its part in the overall process.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. There's a follow-up question that's related to this as well, and perhaps addressing it to Misaka. Mike Back is asking, he's interested in the project reviewers and additional cost-benefit analysis for nature-based solutions in rural and developing country contexts. And he's asking if you have any recommendations for sources or researchers and teams that you work with working on these questions of high-quality studies for cost-benefit analysis.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks, Perrin. Yeah, and of course, Perrin would be able to add to this as well. I'm sure if you take this region, I think there's a certain, a definite lack of resources and examples. There's growing interest, so I'm pretty sure in another 5 years' time there would be sources that we can turn to. But globally, if you look at, like, there are many studies being done or had already completed in Europe, especially around this room for the river program in the Netherlands, and there's a lot of, like, smaller scale work happening in the UK. The US Army Corps of Engineers is, like, into this big time. There hopefully there was this big like a resource book being developed, which is supposed to come out early this year, but probably it was hindered a little bit because of the COVID situation, but yeah, hopefully it will come early next year. So there's an evidence base growing and cost-benefit techniques being kind of sorted out for natural and nature-based methods, but specifically on this region, I think there's a lack of resources. But one solution for this, one way kind of to get out of this deadlock might be to refer to other sectors. Like, there's a lot of work done on soil bioengineering in this region, which overlaps a lot with natural and nature-based methods, the techniques, and the approaches and so on. So probably we can learn from that sector. There are enough experts in the region and a lot of work being done, so that there might be other sectors, similar sectors, which we can learn from here, and use to address similar questions. Thanks, Perrin.
Yeah, thanks, Misaka. I'll use my moderator's privilege to chime in here as well. These questions, because there are a few questions, I'm looking at the chat box on maintenance and regional guidelines and standards for nature-based solutions. This was one of the questions I asked with a student working with me, reviewing both the scientific literature as well as the gray literature from multilateral banks, from the Flood Green Guide from WWF, also some very interesting work coming out of the RISE program from Australia, that's looking at implementation of nature-based solutions for water management in informal settlements in Asia Pacific. So anyone interested, I'm also happy to share our results. We have a list of regional guidelines from these various institutions. And in general, what we found is that there is some regional literature, so it's not like we're starting from scratch. Singapore and the ABC Waters program, Water Features program, is also providing some regional knowledge and looking at climate, tropical climate and regional conditions. So that's definitely available. It doesn't mean that we have all the information, but we're not starting from scratch. So that's, again, there's some knowledge, and it's important to translate it and make it reach the people it's supposed to reach. Perhaps I can take another final question before asking you to take the poll again, seeing if these answers have changed. Looking at one that I may have forgotten from Laura here. That's a question to Blair. Considering the design model interaction that you presented, where would you recommend responsible government start, both in an ideal world and based on your experience in the real world?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think all parts of society have a part to play in the process. Where would a responsible government fit in? I guess in facilitating the discussion and facilitating, you know, an in-depth engagement of all stakeholders, whether they be economically privileged or not, or coming from the private or public sector. So in an ideal world, I would see the governments as overall facilitators of an inclusive process. In a practical sense, it's really difficult to answer. Every country, every jurisdiction will have its own constraints and own cultural aspects that play into this. So much too of a technical or much too of a complex aspect for me to have too much of an opinion on, to be perfectly honest.
Yeah, these are complex questions indeed, and we know that a 55-minute webinar is not going to allow us to address them in depth. But I'm hoping that this gave all of you an idea of some of the work that is being done in the region, and do not hesitate to reach out to myself, but any of the speakers and panelists who joined us today. I've reposted the link to the poll, so I invite you to re-answer the poll. I'm going to share my screen in a minute, just to see if some of these discussions have changed the way that you think about these questions. So that's again on wooclap.com and NBS Asia, and we'll conclude the session with this poll. Someone has some last minute thoughts they want to share. I see the numbers coming up. People are thinking, and so while we're looking at the results, I'll like to take this opportunity to thank the three panelists for joining us today. Thank you for sharing your experience in the region. Really appreciate it, and I'm sure the participants learned from your experience. Thank you, David Lallemand, as well, for helping me manage the session. And I think we'll end here and wish you a successful and productive UR 2020 conference. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks
Thank you.
all.